Chapter 1. Welcome to Oakwood Heights. It was a scene straight out of a reality show, one where the person causing the most drama had no idea they were the punchline. Judith Wilkinson, the self-proclaimed protector of Oakwood Heights, stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac, her phone clutched tightly in her manicured hands. Her eyes were locked on the bright orange Lamborghini idling in the driveway. To her, this was an emergency of the highest order. A crime in progress. A black man stepping out of a luxury car in her neighborhood? Absolutely unacceptable. She marched forward with the authority of someone who had never faced a real problem in her life, her voice shrill and unwavering. "Excuse me, sir. What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Dante Williams turned, his sunglasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he took in the sight of the furious middle-aged woman storming toward him. He had barely put one foot out of his car when the interrogation began. He had expected a relaxing evening, a visit to his new property in this so-called exclusive community. But clearly, Judith had other plans for his night. "Good evening to you too," he replied coolly, locking his car with a casual press of a button. Judith wasn't interested in pleasantries. She folded her arms, her face a mask of determination. "This is a private neighborhood, and we don't tolerate suspicious activity. Where did you get that car?" Dante let out a short laugh, one of genuine amusement. "I got it from a dealership. In the same way, most people get their cars." "Why?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but you need to leave before I call the police." Dante raised an eyebrow, taking a slow step toward her. "Ma'am, do you think I stole my own car?" The words seemed to catch Judith off guard for half a second, but she doubled down, her nose flaring. "I think you need to prove that you belong here. This is a secure, upscale community, and we don't just let anyone drive in." Dante inhaled deeply, fighting the urge to let out a sigh. He had seen this scenario play out too many times before, but he had never expected to be the leading man in a live-action version. With a calm smile, he pulled out his key fob and pressed the button, making the Lamborghini's lights flash and the alarm beep twice. "Happy now?" he asked. Judith scoffed, undeterred. "That doesn't prove anything. People steal key fobs all the time." That was when Dante knew she wasn't going to let this go. He could already see her fingers twitching over her phone screen, ready to dial 911, ready to turn what should have been a normal evening into a ridiculous spectacle. "You know what? Go ahead. Call them," Dante said, crossing his arms. "Let's see how this plays out." Judith's lips curled into a smug smile as she pressed the call button. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a suspicious individual attempting to steal a car in Oakwood Heights." Dante shook his head and leaned against his car, watching her dig her own grave. The absurdity of it all wasn't lost on him. He checked his watch. If the cops were anywhere near competent, this whole thing would be over soon. Minutes later, the flashing lights of a patrol car washed over the pristine suburban street, illuminating Judith's triumphant expression. She stepped forward eagerly as the officers got out, gesturing wildly toward Dante. "Thank God you're here. This man," she spat the word like it tasted bitter in her mouth, "was attempting to steal that car. I caught him red-handed." Sergeant Reynolds, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a no-nonsense expression, took one look at Judith, then at Dante. His gaze lingered on the bright orange Lamborghini before flicking back to Dante's relaxed posture. "Dante," he said, tilting his head in recognition. Dante grinned. "Reynolds, good to see you, man." Judith blinked rapidly, her confidence wavering for the first time. You know him?" Sergeant Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, I do. Pretty well, actually." He turned to Dante. "You finally moved in?" "Not yet," Dante replied, motioning to the house. "Just came to check on the place." Judith's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Wait a second, he actually lives here?" "That's right," Dante said, enjoying every second of her unraveling. "I own the house. And the car. Both legally, if you can believe that." Sergeant Reynolds exhaled sharply, already sensing how badly this situation was about to turn against Judith. He turned to her with a look of sheer exasperation. "Ma'am, did you seriously call us to report the owner of the house for being on his own property?" Judith's face turned a dangerous shade of red. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. He didn't belong here. How was I supposed to know?" Reynolds exchanged a look with his partner, both of them trying to suppress their growing annoyance. "Well, now you do." and you wasted police resources in the process. Judith's defensive stance faltered, but her pride wouldn't let her admit fault. But I was only looking out for the community. He should have been more clear about who he was. Dante chuckled, shaking his head. You didn't ask. You assumed. And now you're standing here looking ridiculous. Judith bristled. I demand that you do something about this. He was rude to me, and he was acting suspiciously. Sergeant Reynolds let out a long breath before pulling out his notepad. Actually, ma'am, I'm going to do something. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Judith's face. Finally, you're going to remove him from the neighborhood? Reynolds shook his head. No. I'm going to document your false report and disorderly conduct. He flipped to a blank page. Name. Judith's mouth dropped open. Wait, what? You called in a fake emergency. That's a crime, ma'am, Reynolds said, jotting down notes. And since you wasted our time, I think it's only fair that we take a little trip downtown. Judith's confidence shattered. She stammered, but the damage was done. As the officers escorted her to the squad car, Dante leaned against his Lamborghini, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. He had been mistaken for a criminal before. But this was next-level ridiculous. Chapter 2. The fallout begins. Judith's arrest sent shockwaves through Oakwood Heights. Within hours, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. The HOA group chat exploded with messages ranging from outrage to barely concealed amusement. Some residents defended Judith, claiming she was simply trying to protect the community, while others saw it for what it was, racial profiling at its worst. But the real spectacle came the next morning. Dante was sitting on his porch, sipping coffee and enjoying the calm before the inevitable storm, when a sleek black SUV pulled into Judith's driveway. A tall, thin man in a stiff gray suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as he made his way to her front door. Within minutes, Judith emerged, her face a mask of anger and humiliation. She was yelling at the man, at the sky, at fate itself. Dante smirked. That must be her lawyer. Moments later, another car arrived, this time a local news van. A reporter and a cameraman hopped out, clearly ready for a story. Judith's voice carried across the cul-de-sac as she argued with them, waving her hands in frantic gestures. Dante's phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, an older woman who had lived in the community for over 30 years. Are you watching this mess? Dante chuckled and texted back. Oh, you know I am. Judith's voice rose, and Dante couldn't resist wandering over to get a closer look. He leaned casually against his car as he listened. This is an outrage. I was just trying to protect my neighborhood, and now I'm being treated like a criminal. Judith ranted to the reporter, her face red with frustration. He was acting suspicious. Any reasonable person would have done the same thing. The reporter, a composed woman with sharp eyes, held the microphone steady. Ma'am, the police report states that Mr. Williams was standing in his own driveway at the time of your call. Can you clarify why you felt threatened by that? Judith's mouth opened and closed. She was floundering. Well, how was I supposed to know he lived there? She demanded. People like that don't just. She stopped short, realizing what she was about to say. But it was too late. The reporter's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. The cameraman zoomed in. Dante let out a low whistle. Oh, Judith, you just buried yourself. Chapter 3. The HOA Strikes Back. By the afternoon, the footage had gone viral, at least within their small suburban bubble. Clips of Judith's outbursts spread across social media, shared in local Facebook groups and Twitter threads. The comments were relentless. People like that? Oh, we know exactly what she meant. This woman is exactly why HOA boards need to be regulated. Dante handled that with more patience than I ever could. But while the public turned against Judith, the HOA had other plans. That evening, a formal notice was delivered to Dante's door. The envelope was pristine, the HOA's official logo embossed in gold. He opened it with mild curiosity, already suspecting what it contained. Notice of violation. Dear Mr. Williams, it has come to our attention that your vehicle has been parked in the driveway in a manner inconsistent with Oakwood Heights community aesthetic. As per HOA regulations, all vehicles must be stored in garages or designated parking areas. Failure to comply may result in fines or further disciplinary action. Dante let out a slow breath. So this is their play? He knew the HOA was petty, But this was a whole new level of ridiculous. They couldn't come for him directly, not without looking like the villains they were. So they were going for the next best thing: bogus violations. Dante grinned as he pulled out his phone and took a photo of the letter. Then, he posted it directly into the HOA's community forum with a single caption. "Guess I'm not the only one who thinks Judith's the problem. Stay tuned." And just like that, the real war had begun. Chapter 4. The Final Blow. The HOA's retaliation was predictable, but Dante was ready for it. Over the next few days, more violation notices arrived. His grass was too tall, his porch light was too bright, and, absurdly, his recycling bin was not properly aligned with community standards. Dante collected each notice, cataloging them like evidence in a trial. He had seen this playbook before: bureaucratic harassment disguised as regulation. But what the HOA hadn't counted on was that Dante was 2 steps ahead. That weekend, he invited a few of his new neighbors over for a barbecue. Mrs. Carmichael, a few younger couples, and even some longtime residents who had been tired of the HOA's tyranny all gathered in his backyard. As the smell of grilled ribs filled the air, Dante pulled out his laptop and projected his screen onto the side of his house. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, holding up one of the ridiculous violation notices, "we all know what this is about. The HOA thinks they can scare me off. What they don't realize is that I've done my homework." He clicked on a document. Turns out, a large portion of these so-called rules were put in place without a proper community vote. In fact, according to county records, Judith and her little crew have been enforcing technically unenforceable rules. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Carmichael cackled. "Oh, this is good." Dante smirked. "And that's not all. You see, HOAs are bound by their own bylaws, which means that if they break them, like issuing false fines or misusing funds, they can be sued. And guess what? I've already spoken to a lawyer." The reaction was electric. Neighbors whispered excitedly, some pulling out their phones to start recording. "Now," Dante continued, "we could each fight them individually. Or we could do something better. We could vote them out." Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The HOA's annual election was coming up, and Dante made sure every single homeowner was prepared. He organized meetings, distributed flyers, and exposed every shady HOA practice he had uncovered. As Judith scrambled to hold on to power, she found herself drowning in a tidal wave of residents who had finally had enough. When Election Day arrived, the turnout was the largest in Oakwood Heights history. The votes were counted, and the results were undeniable. Judith and her entire board were removed. The new leadership? A mix of longtime residents, younger families, and yes, Dante himself. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. With the HOA under new management, the ridiculous fines were overturned, and common-sense policies replaced the old, oppressive rules. More importantly, Judith, now stripped of her power, quietly put her house up for sale and left town. A week later, Mrs. Carmichael walked up to Dante as he washed his car. "Well, Mr. Williams," she said, grinning. "You did it. You took down the HOA tyrant." Dante chuckled. "Just doing my civic duty." She patted his shoulder. "Don't let the power go to your head, kid." He smiled, watching as the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one where people could simply live their lives, without fear of citations for parking in their own driveways. For the first time in years, Oakwood Heights truly felt like home. The war was over, and Dante had won.